This time I got a Yamaha TSX120. This was an old iPod dock for an original iPod. It has an AM/FM radio and probably a clock on it as well. The display has gone dead. The guy that owns it thinks it's a light bulb. Let's see if he's right. Today I have a Yamaha. This is a desktop audio system. It's called TSX120. Features a radio, and it has an original iPod dock, which of course nobody's using anymore because Apple went and changed all their connectors. This one here, he says the display is not working on. So let's take a look and see what's going on with the display. See if it can be repaired. Don't know even what type of display this has. Is it an LCD with a backlight, or is it a fluorescent, a vacuum fluorescent? This looks to be, this is a vacuum fluorescent. Looking at it here. So let's try turning it on. We hear it hissing, so we know that the amplifier is on, and we indeed have no display. The fellow that owns this, I think he was thinking initially that it was an incandescent display because he suggested that a light bulb needed to be replaced, and I kind of said to him when he brought it over, well, if it's an incandescent display, that's possible. Obviously, it's not an incandescent display, so this is going to be a power supply problem. Or it could be the driver chip that's gone bad. Vacuum fluorescent displays require a high voltage power source, and usually the way that they derive that power source is they use a pump system to pump up the voltage from a lower voltage. Sometimes they'll have a higher voltage winding on the transformer, but usually they don't. Usually they derive it from the normal 9 or 12 volt supply, and they just use a voltage doubler or a voltage tripler that is using capacitors and diodes to pump the voltage up. At least that's the way Panasonic does it on their tuners, for example. As I've had tuners that have had no display or very weak display, and it's been capacitors that have caused it. So first things first, let's take the bottom off this one, or the top, or whatever comes off. I guess it's the top that comes off. And this is probably going to be plugged in somewhere. I'm sure undo a cable. Oh, the display is on a separate board on the front of it here. All right, let's get a couple big ribbon cables here that are going to have to be undone. I have to laugh. Who designed something like this? Yamaha, that's who. Like, what the? So the connector on the left is connected to a connector on the right at the back, and the connector on the right is connected to a connector on the left. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Somebody kind of dropped the ball, I think, when they designed this one. And once they started assembling it, they was like, oops. So I'm marking the cables left and right accordingly, so that when they're put back in, they'll be put back into the correct position. Now I can get to the front board, but the problem is likely not on this board. I don't think there's any electrolytics on this one. It's more than likely one of these ones in the back here. This supply voltage, either that or it could be the display itself, which is unlikely, or the display driver chip, which is, I'm sure, going to be on one of these boards. The only way I'm going to be able to test this unit, of course, is to remove the entire display, and there is actually a couple caps on this board here, so good chance it's one of these ones that's gone bad, because I'm sure they're forming the voltages for the display on this board. I'm going to reconnect the two main connectors so that I can test this unit out. Let's unplug the auxiliary. I think it unplugs. Does it unplug? Maybe it doesn't unplug. The little board for the auxiliary does not unplug. I'm going to plug these back in so that I can test it, and then see if we can get the display to work again. It's kind of a stupid design, and everything's ready to short circuit out here if I'm not careful, so I got to kind of hold this away from anything that can touch and we'll apply power. Oh look, it's got little white painted speakers. Alright, power is this one here. First things first, we'll check to see if there's any power to the filaments, because if the filaments aren't lit, it's not gonna work. So we need to see if we've got any voltage across the filaments, and usually it's an AC voltage, but I will check for both AC and DC. Filaments are always the pins on the end. I have no DC voltage there. What about AC voltage? I have nothing. I have no voltage whatsoever on the filament, so that's a good place to start. We'll check for voltages getting to the board itself. There's 3 capacitors here, so let's just check to see if we're getting any voltages to these capacitors. There's 2 10 microfarad rated at 50 volts, so let's just see if there's any juice getting to any of these. 33 volts, that's good. That means there's power there. This one has, what's it got on it? 33 volts as well. And this other one here has 3 volts. That's probably the voltage for the filaments. But I don't see anything across the filaments whatsoever. So we got to check for a connection. Maybe it's going to be something as simple as a connection that's broken. Wouldn't that be nice if it was something that simple? It's not going to be that simple, but it would be nice. It's a nice thought if it would be something simple like that. Remove the board from this bracket so I can check it. If we look at this display, you will see that there's only 13 connections here to drive this entire display. Now this display, in addition to having a bunch of 7-segment digits and single operation digits, it also has a 5x7 matrix alphanumeric display. There's only 13 total pins. There's not enough combination of pins for these to be driven from an external display control IC. Therefore, this vacuum display must have active circuitry on it. There's got to be a drive IC embedded in the glass somewhere inside here, because there's just too many anodes to be driven directly, even any which way you wire it. Normally, on a multiplex display, you will have one for each element, and then you'll have one for each display, which can be turned off grids. You can see the grids here. These grids can all be controlled separately. There's one grid, another grid, a third grid, a fourth grid, a fifth grid, a sixth grid, but then each one of these is a separate grid that's driven separately. Now 5x7, you drive each digit is driven one at a time. So it illuminates each electrode for the anode, and then it turns on the screen to allow electrons to flow or not. So the screen that sits in front is what controls whether you see any light or not, and they are strobed. Right? We don't have enough contacts for all the electrodes or all the screens and all the anodes. Right? So there's got to be processing on board on this chip. But I don't have any voltage I have nothing across the filaments. So the first thing first is we're going to check the connections. Make sure that all these connections are good on both the pins here and on the display. And then we'll try it again and see whether that solves any issues. Other than that, I'll put my scope on and see if I've got drive signals. But it could be a bad display that's gone bad. Certainly could be a bad display. Can't see inside there whether there's anything inside this display or not, but there's likely something embedded in the glass. Just like they do with LCD and plasma screens. They have the drive ICs built right into the glass itself. They build the IC up on the back side of the display and drive it directly and then embed it inside the glass itself. Just gonna going to resolder all these connections. Let's see whether that will restore the display. And we'll check for some voltages, and if it's not that, I'm going to have to write this one off, because the guy that owns this thing here, I don't think he wants to spend a lot of money on it. He just uses it as a radio, because his iPod that he had for it is long gone, so it doesn't really have much in the way of value. But right now it's kind of useless because you can't see what frequency it's tuned to. So as it sits right now, it's not much use at all. Lead-free solder is terrible to work with. Oh, the wind is starting to whip up outside. It's a storm today. Our first storm of the year. That cap that I measured the 3 volts on, that's likely the voltage for the filaments, and this may be a DC driven panel, like filaments, maybe DC on this. I watched the news today, oh boy. It's about a lady that had her patio furniture stolen right off of her porch in the middle of the night. If you can believe it, a guy pulled up in the U-Haul and walked up and carried away all of her patio furniture and loaded it into a U-Haul that he backed into her driveway. All caught on her doorbell cam. You can imagine her horror in the morning when she woke up, went out front and, what the hell? I thought we had all the patio furniture here. Went back and looked at her camera just to see some guy carting it all away. Talk about a brazen robbery. That's why you don't have nice patio furniture. Like me, my patio furniture is all old. And even my TV that sits out on the patio is about a 1989 vintage old CRT TV that I've had since like 1989. Gets analog TV stations, so it's not much use unless you have a modulator to feed it modern signals. All right, let's plug this thing in again and see whether it lights up. I'm not holding out much hope that it will, but we have to try. Nope. I see absolutely no signs of life. So let's check some voltages. There's a good indicator right there that we have no filaments, because in infrared mode we should see these filaments glowing. They should be lighting up like a Christmas tree. Notice my little Casio display here. When I hit the button for the time, you'll see that the filament in front lights up. So we should see the filament glowing here, but we see nothing. So until the filament has got power and emitting electrons, we won't expect to see any light whatsoever. I have 3 volts on each side. One side should be grounded, I would think, or going to a negative supply, but it's not. So there's no cathode voltage. There's no voltage across the filaments to heat them, plus no electron emitting negative bias. I'm going to scope all the pins going into the display and see if there's any activity on any of these pins. I'll show you guys the results. I don't see any activity on any of these pins. I'll show you guys the scope as I try to change functions that would normally, I think, just cause the display to change. I should see activity trying to drive the display. And it's looking more and more like it's probably the main display processor on the board, which is going to be on the main board back here. But I'll show you the display. Okay, here's our filament. It's more like at 2.04 volts at 32 kilohertz. That's on one side. 2.04 on one side, and the other side has 2.2. 2.2. 2.0. So there's a 0.2 volt difference. That sounds more like why the display is not lighting up. But let me look at some of the other voltages on here while we're at it. This is pin number 1. As we can see, there's a 3.42 volt signal. This is the second pin. The third pin has nothing on it. When I try to change the volume or anything, nothing happens. Pin 4, nothing. Pin 5, nothing. Pin 6, nothing. Pin 7, nothing. Pin 8, nothing. 9, nothing. 10, nothing. 11, nothing. 12, nothing. And 13, nothing. So the only two pins that have got any activity on them is pin 1 and pin 2. And pin 1 has data activity, you can see. There's some activity there. Always there, and this pin 2 looks to be the clock because it's stable. Try pushing the display button. Nothing's changing. So something's going on, and it's looking like more and more it might be back at the main display processor on the main board that is not sending it a signal. Now I'm looking at the header coming in from the main board, and it looks like they're all labeled here like key 1, key 2. These ones are on ground, I think. I think I'm going to wash my hands on this unit, just because the fact that, well, first of all, I think the guy's expecting that this thing is just a light bulb that's burned out, and it's obviously more than that. The repair on this is going to be much more, I think, than he's ever planning on spending. And I'm thinking it might be, I think that's probably the display processor down here anyway, because this is the one that plugs in, right? This is the one that's got the connections that go through to the display. It's feeding it a data signal. There's going to be a processor on here as well, I'm sure. And but there's no activity other than that clock. I don't see any other activity. When I push any keys, I would expect to see activity between the main processor, the main display processor, and the display. I'm not seeing any activity whatsoever, so it's leading me to think that there's something on the main board that's gone bad. Probably the main micro has gone bad, or something has failed on it. So I think at this point I'm just going to throw this together and give it back to the guy, because he was thinking it was like an incandescent bulb that burned out. That's what he was thinking when he brought it to me. He said the light bulb behind the display is burned out. Well, obviously that's not the case, and this is one of these things that's going to get more involved. And for basically an AM/FM radio, because he doesn't have the iPod anymore, so this part's completely useless. And unless he plugs like something else into it through the external input, it's just not worth it. You know, I mean, these were a few $100s when they were new, but just looking at the age of it from the type of connector, you know that this thing is quite old, and there's no service data or anything available on it. And even if there was, it really wouldn't be worth fixing. So I'm going to put this one back together and hand it back to him and let him know that this one just is not economical to repair.